So, hi, Bill.
Hello, Don.
Welcome to the end of week 3. We're starting on week 4.
Yes, we are.
We've had pretty exciting time over in the lab. I know you've been watching and jumping in a little bit, and we've been trading a lot of Bitcoins back and forth around the class. And I think one of the things that we were talking about that we found really interesting, and something that had really changed since probably the last time we did the class, is that our first few transactions didn't clear very fast. You know, what the design for Bitcoin is that these transactions are supposed to have one confirmation every 10 minutes, and the system's supposed to adjust in order to make sure that's happening. But actually, we saw a couple transactions that we were sending in the class take almost 5 days to confirm.
Unbelievable.
5 days, yeah. And that was with transaction fees. So there were transaction fees on them, and they were taking 5 days. And that's kind of unheard of in my experience with Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something new. So I wonder if we can sort of speculate about what might have been up during the days when we were doing that assignment.
Yeah, so I tried just a basic Google search to see if there was some explanation, but couldn't find anything. And so I started looking at some of the charts on it. Let me see if I can put some of the charts online on our viewers, for our viewers here. So here's one chart. This is a graph of the number of transactions per day. And you can see that it's been growing slowly over time, you know, from August 14th to June 15th. But then right at the end, there's this huge spike in the number of transactions. And I was trying to think, like, what could that be happening from?
And that's probably not caused by our class, because
right.
transactions in the hundreds of thousands here.
As important as we like to think we are, yeah, these are hundreds of thousands of transactions. And the Bitcoins, you know, the number is almost doubling, or maybe even over double the number of transactions there. So
what's been happening in the world that might lead to such a thing?
Well, the first thing that I thought of was Greece. You know, Greece is going through this big negotiation with the European Union about whether or not they are going to have to create a whole new currency system as they leave the euro. But
there have been some reports of Greeks buying Bitcoin and also buying things like Macintosh computers and jewelry as a store of value and a hedge against whatever might happen with the currency.
And the last time that Greece went through a crisis several years ago, there were a couple reports about lots of different local currencies springing up in Greece that weren't blockchain based or weren't cryptocurrency based, but were just local currencies that people were using in villages. Now, the only problem with this hypothesis, though, is that Greece's economy is about the size of Iowa, and it doesn't seem like that alone could be accounting for the change in the Bitcoin transactions. So the other big thing that's going on is, of course, China, which has had this huge crash in their stock market.
Yep.
So we were trying to see if we could find some visualization, some way of trying to understand where the transactions are happening from. But of course, we've talked about it in various ways that Bitcoin's anonymous. And so we don't really know much about the people who are transmitting their transactions. We know a little bit about the IP addresses of the miners, and we could find different visualizations showing where the miners were that were collecting these transactions, but you can't really find out where the people are that are doing the transactions, because they're just putting them on the network without necessarily even tracing back to their IP address. But what you can figure out is you can figure out the exchanges between fiat currencies and Bitcoin. So let me see if I can find that graph. So here's an example of one. It's called Fiat Leak, and what they show in this visualization is how much currency is being exchanged between Bitcoin and a national fiat currency. And what you see from this graph is that there's an enormous amount of currency being transformed into Bitcoin from China. And maybe second, it looks like US dollars. But if you watch this visualization for a few minutes, all you see are China and the US. So the crash of the Chinese stock market seems to be the most plausible explanation here for what's going on with the number of transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Yeah, it certainly seems that that's the explanation. What you're watching is in real time. And of course, we're recording this on Sunday. So members of the class, you can go to fiatleak.com and just keep an eye on this and see what's happening during the week. And probably you're going to continue to see this pattern of a lot of transactions out of Chinese currency and into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Just to think about it for a minute, it was taking some of your transactions between 1 and 5 days to clear, right? Between 1 and 5 days. For comparative purposes, the Visa network, when you use your Visa card, is doing around 56,000 transactions per second. Okay, so if you want to think about, can Bitcoin become scalable? Can Bitcoin occupy the same kind of role that something like the Visa card does in our day-to-day lives? Well, when you have, the Chinese stock market crash tying up the miners and gumming up the work, so to speak, you have to kind of scratch your head and ask if it's really viable at this point.
And I don't want to jump ahead too quick, but one of the articles that we are going to ask you to comment on in week 5 is exactly about this question of how do we scale up, how does one scale up the Bitcoin network in order to accommodate more transactions?
Right.
So then in the discussion, we had a lot of talk about cash and Bitcoin. And do you want to touch on that, Bill?
I want to say a little bit about cash. Yeah. There was discussion around Bitcoin versus cash with regard to anonymity. And
right.
One of the things that we were having some discussions about there were that, some of you were saying that cash is not anonymous, because if I hand some cash to you, well, I can see you, you can see me, and it's not anonymous. Well, the thing is really, I can see you and you can see me during the moment of that transaction, but there's no proof of it afterwards. And I don't have to know who you are. You can be a clerk in a store. I don't even have to know your name. And there's nothing to prove that that transaction happened. There's nothing to prove that we were the two transacting parties. Even if we were to get a receipt, that helps. But it still would be really hard with a cash transaction to say, yes, it was Bill Maurer who brought me this $10 bill and went away with the book that he bought today or something like that. Unless you had, cameras monitoring every interaction, or some third party there verifying that the parties were exchanging, we were showing our IDs or something like that. So cash is actually pretty anonymous, absent other infrastructures and institutions to record the transaction. And there's no built-in record keeping with cash, right? This is why people love it for under-the-table activities. And everything from, paying your babysitter or a housekeeper and not leaving a paper trail because you don't want it to be reported to the IRS or whatever, everything from that to, seriously illicit and illegal things. The blockchain is really interesting. It creates a permanent and verified record that anybody can look at of all the transactions in the entire Bitcoin universe. So you've got this permanent record that's there and that's verified. The thing is, it's really hard to know exactly the identities of the transacting parties. You can see all the addresses, but it's kind of pseudo-anonymous or quasi-anonymous because you can't see the identity behind those transactions. So there's some really subtle differences here between the anonymity of cash and the quasi-anonymity of Bitcoin that has a lot to do with the fact that Bitcoin is at its heart a kind of distributed ledger-based system. So that was one key thing about cash and anonymity. And I think Don wanted to add something else. Yeah,
there's this, because there's this perpetual chain of events showing you where your Bitcoin came from. It kind of imposes this social pressure, or this obligation to know where the Bitcoin came from. And that isn't present in cash. When you have cash, it doesn't really matter where the cash came from. You spend it without any regard of whether it was used in a crime or whether it was used to support a charity beforehand. It doesn't make the cash isn't more or less valued because of that. It's kind of the same thing with stock transactions. You don't know much about where your stock came from. But in Bitcoin, because there's this record, there have been some high-profile thefts of Bitcoin, and the person who had the Bitcoin stolen from them will show people in the blockchain the transaction at which the thief moved the blockchain from the rightful owner's address to some other address that's unknown. And there's a lot of discussion about in the Bitcoin community about whether or not it's okay to spend those Bitcoins later down in the transaction stream because you know that they were stolen previously, even if you don't know the address that they were sent to. So, this blockchain, this ledger is good for record keeping, but it ends up imposing these other kinds of pressures about whether or not it's okay to use that Bitcoin in a way that you just don't really run into with cash unless the cash, is covered with blood or, cocaine or something like that.
Someone's marked on it, I use this dollar bill for crime.
Right.
People don't go around doing that.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing about cash and Bitcoin that came up a little bit in the forums that I wanted to talk about because it will come up again in the coming weeks' readings and discussions. Cash and Bitcoin share one quality. They are what we call a push payment or a push transaction. What this means is that when I have a dollar bill and I am paying for something with it, I basically push that value out to you, right? I'm giving it directly to you. It's being pushed out to you, and once it's in your hand, it's yours. Similarly with Bitcoin, right? When I send you a Bitcoin, I'm pushing it to you, and then once it's been transferred, once the transaction has been verified, that's it. It's yours. It's pushed out. That's in contrast to what we call pull transactions. In pull transactions, what we do is something like the following. I want to pay you something. So what I do is I say to you, I would like to pay you $10, and I authorize you to go into my account and take that $10. So there's a two-step process here. I'm authorization, and then you're going in there and pulling it out of my account. That's how most credit and debit transactions work with payment cards. And there are interesting qualities of push versus pull transactions that we're going to get into next week. But the one just to think about for now is that with a push transaction, once you've pushed that value out, and think of it like a ball that you're throwing to someone else, once you throw that ball, that's it. You can't get it back. There's no way for you to get that back unless you tackle the person and beat them up and take it out of their hands by force, which you're just not probably going to do. With pull transactions, because there's this two-step process and this authorization, there is a way to get the money back. And in the card industry, they call those chargebacks. And that gives you a recourse if things go wrong. If you meant to pay $10, but accidentally you paid $100, there's a way to get it back with a pull transaction. But there's no way to get it back in a push transaction. If I need to hand on 10, he can pocket it, and then he can say, oh, no, you gave me a 10, and that's it. That 20 of mine is lost forever. So think about push and pull and the different dynamics there. We'll be getting into that a bit in the coming week. And in the coming week, I've kind of prefaced this a bit, what we're really going to be doing next is diving into the payments industry. And the payments industry is that collection of businesses, infrastructures, government agencies, and technologies that together facilitate the means of value transfer in our contemporary economy. We're really going to take a deep dive into the payments industry and look at everything from cash to checks to debit cards to credit cards and to things like PayPal and Apple Pay, so that you can really understand the ecosystem into which Bitcoin and blockchain technologies seem to be trying to insert themselves. And one of your assignments in the coming week is going to be to go out into the world and buy something with a non-cash method of payment. We want you to get up from your computer, go off into the physical world, and buy something using cash. And then we're going to have you write about it. And there are further instructions on the website and instructions on the roadmap as well, because we really want you to start seeing the act of payment electronically with new eyes and to start to become experts in the payments industry. One of the assigned for the week is a book called Payment Systems in the United States. You're going to have to purchase that. It's available online. It's relatively inexpensive. This isn't an academic book. This is a book that's by industry professionals when they're having to come up to speed on this industry. So having read this book, you guys are going to be experts in the payments industry and all the nuts and bolts of digital transactions. So I hope that you enjoy that. And I think, Don, did you have anything to add?
The only thing I want to say is that we did this first. We went out and found a coffee shop in Irvine that takes Bitcoin and actually has a Bitcoin ATM. And so one of the videos this week is just showing you one place you could go if you wanted to spend Bitcoin in the physical world. But you don't have to do that for the assignment. You can use any form of payment. But just to set a good example for the class, we did that first.
Yep. You can go try to use Bitcoin in the physical world. You can use Apple Pay or Google Wallet or Soft Card if anybody has that, or Samsung Pay, or just your debit card or a credit card, or maybe you've got the PayPal app on your phone and you can find a store that'll accept that. And I'll just add this right here on the fly. If you try to pay and it fails, write about that too. That's totally acceptable.
Yeah, that's been my experience with Bitcoin so far. In the physical world, it's only failed, but coffee shop being one exception.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's the past week, and that's the week ahead. And we hope you enjoy exploring the world of payments.
And we'll see you online.
Bye.
Bye.